So, good evening again. Welcome back to our workshop on heritage from the margins, Shuri Castle and the politics of memory. So I hope you all enjoyed our first panel where we sought to situate Shuri Castle and discussions about Shuri Castle in the contested meanings that, sorry, bear with me 1 second. Okay. Within the contested meanings that it has both on the ground and more broadly. In this second session, which is a plenary discussion, we'd like to really focus in on the first word of our title, which is heritage, and discuss a little bit about how heritage is constituted more from the outside, both at a national and a global level, how heritage comes to be ascribed and constituted in particular sites and places. To help us do that, I will introduce the moderator of this session. Is my Kyushu University colleague, Dr. Ellen van Goetem. So Dr. van Goetem is Associate Professor of Japanese History and the History of Ideas at the Faculty of the Humanities here at Kyushu University. Her disciplinary background is heritage with a capital H, I think it's fair to say. So the Asuka, Nara and Heian periods, but recently she's been working on a project looking at the foundation of Heian Jingu, and is slowly moving towards contemporary heritage. We'll get her up here eventually. It's a long process, but we're looking forward to her joining us. So I'd like to just basically hand over now to Ellen for the remainder of the discussion. Just quickly to the audience and panelists. Panelists, if you want to indicate questions in the chat function, and to our audience, if you put them in the Q&A, and Ellen will seek to collate them all later on in the discussion. So with that, Ellen, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, and also to Vicky and to Ran. In a sense, I feel a little bit of an interloper because you guys put everything together, and I'm just here for moderating this plenary session. Yes, as Ted already said, I'm a historian of Japan, of ancient Japan, and so my most recent project does engage with more contemporary issues, Heian Jingu and the reconstruction or the restoration of buildings, which gives me kind of a tangential connection to Shuri because of the involvement of Ito Chuta. But my purpose of being here is actually in part to introduce our guests for the plenary session and to moderate the whole. As Ted already indicated, I will also be keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A sections to see if any additional questions come in. So do send them along so we can make the most out of these 50 minutes. So welcome all, happy time of the day wherever you are, and I will get started by introducing our two guests. Our first guest is Professor Kono Toshiyuki. He is Executive Vice President of Kyushu University and is affiliated with the Department of International Legal Studies in our Faculty of Law. He is also Honorary President of the International Council on Monuments and Sites, better known as ICOMOS, after having served as the Council's President from 2017 until last December. Professor Kono is an expert in private international law and international heritage law, and in addition to his many publications on international law and intellectual property, Professor Kono has also published on principles and notions of authenticity, laws regulating the protection and preservation of cultural property, and the UNESCO Convention on the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. He was also a member of the group of experts who drafted the Convention for Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage in the early 2000s. And then finally, I would also like to spotlight an online project that he is involved with, which is the Heritage on the Edge project, which focuses on the use of technology to protect and preserve heritage that is affected by climate change. So welcome, Professor Kono. Our second guest here tonight is Professor Simon Kainer. Professor Kainer is Executive Director at the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures, as well as the Director of the Center for Japanese Studies at the University of East Anglia. He is an archaeologist, so in that sense, maybe we have a bit more in common, specializing in the prehistory of Japan, and his research interests include Japanese prehistory and the history of archaeology in Japan, as well as Japanese cultural heritage and the international role of Japanese heritage management. He has also worked for several years in archaeological heritage management in the UK. Professor Kainer is series editor of ArchaeoPress's Comparative Studies in Japanese Archaeology and Heritage, and is also involved in a very fascinating online resource, the online resource in Japanese archaeology and cultural heritage. He is currently co-editing the Oxford Handbook of the Archaeology of Korea and Japan, and has co-edited the Illustrated Companion to Japanese Archaeology, as well as the Archaeology of Medieval Towns, Case Studies from Japan and Europe. Personally, I'm actually looking forward to a recent work, and which might also interest the audience, because it will be a study of Okinoshima, the outstanding universal value of Japan's sacred heritage. So another UNESCO World Heritage Site in Japan. So welcome, Professor Kainer. So to start off our discussion, I'm also going to reference some of the earlier topics that were covered in the previous panel, but one of the topics that I would like to start off with is that of authenticity. Because this concept, it plays an important role in steering the inscription procedures of heritage sites on the World Heritage List. It is also central to any reconstruction, restoration, or conservation project. And specifically with Shuri Castle, of course, I think it was also pointed out earlier by Ra. In part, it is what is underneath the structures that is the actual heritage that needs to be preserved and that needs to be authentic. But if you look at the UNESCO documents, they also talk about the reconstructed Shuri Castle in terms as it's restored and it's an exact replica. So there is an aspect of authenticity to that as well. Of course, these structures, before they burnt down in 2019, they were finished in 1992, which is just before the Nara document on authenticity was created. So I was actually wondering, Professor Kono, first, whether you could share some of your views on authenticity in your role as the former president of ICOMOS. And also whether in between the 1992 reconstruction of Shuri Castle and then the transition to the Nara document on authenticity, and then the current need to again reconstruct these structures, whether there are any shifts in understanding authenticity for Shuri Castle.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you. Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me. It's a great honor for me to be present at this workshop. And thank you very much, Ellen, for your very kind introduction. And Professor Kainer, very nice to see you. Very nice to see you. Authenticity, well, actually, from my legal background, I have been very much interested in normative aspect in the domain of heritage, and as soon as I started to work as an ICOMOS executive, it occurred to me that authenticity, the debate, let's say, in the last 10 years, maybe more than 10 years, the authenticity debate did not develop well. That was my impression. As you rightly mentioned, the Seiden was mentioned in ICOMOS recommendation for the inscription. This is quite exceptional. So I think this is a sort of praise for those who worked to reconstruct the Seiden in 1992. Actually, originally authenticity was understood as a material authenticity, but then the Nara document relaxed and then expanded the scope, and then but currently we need to develop something, especially we have more disasters, natural disasters and man-made disasters, and even World Heritage sites have been attacked and then destroyed. So there's a strong wish in the local communities to reconstruct the damaged or destroyed World Heritage sites, but operational guideline still prohibits, in principle, the reconstruction. And the World Heritage Committee does not dare to touch it because it may open a Pandora box. So it's a very tricky situation at the moment, and therefore also the disasters are very, let's say, diverse. So when I started to work on authenticity issues, I thought that one size fits all model would not work. So I started with case studies, and so from case studies, perhaps we could let's say withdraw something. And well, the case study project took more time than I expected, and I started in 2017, and then with the pilot studies, and then ICOMOS expanded its activities as a joint project with ICROM, and ICOMOS and ICROM organized a case study project together. And just yesterday, we celebrated the completion of the project, and the outcomes are now available on our websites. So then we have very carefully crafted and peer-reviewed case study reports. And now, from now on, based on these case studies, then we have to start to work on the lessons from these cases. So I hope I described clearly, but Venice Charter, Nara document, but there was a lacuna, and then the case study. That was actually the current state.
So I'm sure we can expect further developments and further changes in the future. Before we continue that strand, I also want to pull in Professor Kainer. And since Ted started the conference with saying we're also, if we need to, we can be controversial and we're going to be exploratory. Professor Kainer, again, on the topic of authenticity, I would like to ask you, with your background in archaeology, again, if you look through the documentation connected to Shuri Castle, this exact replica that I mentioned earlier is not just based on earlier drawings and photographs that were mentioned earlier on, but the document very explicitly also states that it is based on archaeological excavations. Now, we've also heard, or most of us who have read up a little bit about the history of Shuri Castle after the Ryukyu king left his place of residence and went up north. This castle went through many different lives, and one of those was actually the Japanese military, the Imperial Army being stationed there and tunneling under the castle and making all kinds of caves. So how much archaeology is there? And maybe not specifically to Shuri Castle, but I get the impression with a lot of the heritage documents that there tends to be an attitude that archaeology can give us many answers in terms of authenticity. So I would actually like your opinion on that.
Thank you, Ellen. And can I begin just by saying a huge thank you to the organisers and congratulate you all on what is turning out to be a really interesting day, and to say what a real honour it is to be on this panel with Professor Connor, who I haven't had the opportunity to meet previously, but I am aware of your very significant work, and the new work that you're talking about that's just coming online now sounds fascinating. Okay, authenticity. I'm sorry, I can't actually see myself on the screen, but I'm hoping that you can see what's behind me, which is the Cathedral Close of Norwich Cathedral, which is where my research institute, the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures, is located. And we're in a building which, a part of which dates back to the 12th century and forms part of the outer cloisters of this rather beautiful Norman cathedral that we have as our next door neighbour. But you'll see behind me, there's been some rebuilding going on, and the building that is there is a range of buildings which now houses a lecture theatre and a restaurant, which were rebuilt in the early 2000s after languishing as ruins ever since Henry VIII knocked down the Benedictine cathedral around which which was built around Norwich Cathedral. We have many visitors come to this beautiful site. They enjoy it very much. For them, it's largely a visit to the Cathedral Close, but it's a cathedral close full of history and archaeology. And indeed, when these new buildings went up, there were archaeological excavations undertaken and footings of buildings were replaced. But what you see behind you is not an attempt to reconstruct what we think it originally looked like, but it's taking the idea of what was there, and it's running with that idea. And it was a lot of thought had to go into what would be in keeping with the setting of the cathedral. Now, authenticity is really important to all these debates, particularly important to World Heritage, because authenticity, along with another concept, which is perhaps equally problematic, the concept of integrity, are the two criteria against which nominations for UNESCO World Heritage status are measured. And they're measured in terms of what is called outstanding universal value. And these are the two things that you have to demonstrate authenticity and integrity, and to demonstrate that these sites are of outstanding universal value for the history of humanity altogether. And I think that's really important. You know, the founding goals and dreams of the UNESCO World Heritage Charter were all about the history of humanity. It wasn't about nation states. It wasn't about the politics of heritage. It was about what can this really tell us that we can celebrate that shared global history, if you like, or that shared history of humanity. Now, we'll come back to some of that, I hope, a little bit later on. But I want to talk a little bit, you ask about archaeology, and I'm going to, you said be provocative. So, okay, I'm going to completely disagree with you and with Ra that what is under the site of Shuri Jaw, the archaeology, that's the authentic bit. And then what is stuck on top later is different to that. I had a word with my very esteemed colleague at the University of Tokyo, Dr. Matsuda Akira, who's a great specialist in public archaeology. We were lucky enough to have him at UEA before he went back to the University of Tokyo, where he's in the Department of Cultural Resource Studies. And he sent me some really interesting work that he's been doing, looking at the, if you like, what we might describe as the afterlife of some of these sites. And Shuri Gusku was one of these. And he said, you know, the really interesting period from his perspective is actually what happens between 1945 and 1972, and the ways in which this site is given new meanings. And I think that's a very important point, that we shouldn't assume that authenticity is just what's in the archaeological remains. And that brings me to my third point, which is about archaeology and objectivity. Now, there's a huge problem here because actually heritage, and what we've been hearing about in that first session, demonstrates that, first of all, heritage is not a thing. It's not frozen things locked away in deep time. Heritage is a process which takes us from the very first time in which people use those locations right up to the present day, and potentially, given that now an important part of World Heritage nomination is ensuring there is a management plan well into the future. And I'm interested in Professor Cornell's work on risk management and the impact that that climate change and other disasters is likely to have on heritage. Heritage is actually something into the future as well. And I think that's really very interesting. But and it relates to this question of archaeology and objectivity. And archaeological remains don't speak for themselves. They are always interpreted by archaeologists, and those interpretations shift and change through time as much as the sites themselves do. And I think the discussion that we're having around Shuri demonstrates that, that it's a fascinating process, but it is also a hugely emotive process. And I'd like to just mention, well, I was at a talk a couple of weeks ago by Laura Jane Smith from the Australian National University, who has a wonderful new book out on heritage and emotion. And it's really trying to get to grips with these emotive aspects, the affective aspects of heritage. And a lot of what we've been talking about today, I think, relate to that. And that rather turns any idea that archaeology can be objective on its head. And we should perhaps accept that before we continue our discussions. Thank you.
I am more than willing to accept that, and thank you for your comments on this, because you actually led into my second topic that I wanted to discuss, and it's topic of meaning, and as you pointed out, the archaeological remains, they are underneath, but that's not necessarily what it means to the people interacting with the structures. I think it was Dr. Sakuma who pointed out earlier the difficult emotional reaction when Shuri Castle, which to some might not have been that old, burnt down, and that shows how the importance of human interaction with structures and the creation or the layered meanings of buildings or of monuments. And as you point out rightly, it's certain meanings are being pushed aside. And so my second question was actually the fact that we have these heritage processes, but whether they are national or in the case of UNESCO, whether they're global, in a sense, it fixes a certain narrative, or maybe there's a few different narratives that are being allowed in that process, but the lived experience of the people interacting with the structure on a daily basis is very different, as we've heard from the earlier panel. Tourists respond differently. So in terms of your experiences with heritage management, either in Japan or in the UK, or Professor Kono worldwide, this issue of meaning, and so the risk in assigning a certain meaning to a structure, and then the whole question is, can this meaning be changed retroactively? Maybe Professor Kainer, you're still on my screen and in the speaker position, so maybe I start with you, and then Professor Kono can respond in a few minutes.
Well, thank you. It's a really interesting point, isn't it? I mean, many archaeologists have long struggled with this concept of meaning and what these, what do these things mean? And I think we're sort of in agreement these days that meaning of any archaeological remains is described as a slippery concept. It's difficult to grasp, and it's partly because meaning is not fixed. It depends who it is that's giving it meaning. Obviously, it depends whether it's a government official In the Agency for Cultural Affairs, for example, in Tokyo, it depends whether it's a tourist who's never been to Okinawa before, who's probably dropping in, maybe my sister, for example, on a cruise liner, passing by and spending half a day in Okinawa, but visiting Shurijo and thinking, this is really interesting, but trying to make sense of that with very, very limited information. And we kind of assume as academics that the vast majority of people have done their homework before they go to these sites. I think that is amazingly not the case, or not amazingly, it's definitely not the case. As academics and as educators and people involved in heritage, it's a constant struggle for us to think, how can we get people to get any sense of the meaning of what it is we're trying to convey? And especially when we've got things that have, that have manifestly changed so much. And if you think of the experience, you think of that visitor experience, it was really interesting. I was so interested to hear our colleagues in the earlier panel talk about growing up around Shurijo and thinking, wow, they are they're deeply rooted experiential histories, and they've got great narratives there, but going to be very, very different in terms of meaning to people who are just popping in for a quick view and think it's somewhere else on a tour through Japan, and potentially through Japan and other parts of East Asia or around the Pacific. And those meanings are very different. I think the notion of narrative is very important. And I'd be interested to hear what Professor Cornell has to say about this. But obviously, a contested site like Shurijo, and there's, I think we've now, from the comments we've already heard, we know that there are very different views on it. What kind of narratives can we construct that are the most meaningful? And is there still a place for the voice of authority? There you are. So there's another authority, same root as authentic, maybe, but thinking, what are the authoritative voices on this? Again, going back to Laura Jane Smith, she talks about the authorized heritage discourse, which is a sort of a point of view which is put across by those authority voices, and then that gives everybody else something to react against. And that maybe sort of fits into some of the things that Ra is talking about in terms of which these sites can become places of resistance, bastions of resistance and current political currents. But I'd be sort of, there's this notion of narratives and the different types of narratives and the multivocality that many heritage sites around the world are now trying to grapple with is important. But there's also this notion in here in terms of meaning of whose site is it? And obviously, in a place like Shurijo, that's a very emotive question for the people who are involved. And I imagine most of the people who have joined us today, one way or the other, have got a vested interest in Ryukyuan, Okinawan cultural affairs. And is it just for them, or how do we put those views across to people who may have no broader understanding of that? I think you're muted. You're muted, Ellen.
Yes, I'm muted. Thank you. Thank you. Professor Cornell, would you like to respond to that? And may I ask you also a more personal question, what Shurijo means for you? We've heard the testimonies of the panelists earlier on, but on a personal level, what does Shurijo mean for you as the president of ICOMOS? What does it mean? And then, of course, all the issues of whose site is it? Should there be a wider range of voices being heard now that the castle is being reconstructed? So it's kind of a new starting point in a sense. What are your views here?
Thank you very much. Professor Kenner already touched upon all important issues, but I also agree that the heritage is a process, and it could be a very long process. So throughout the process, the meaning may change, so this said, maybe maybe let me say one thing, that this meaning is, let's say, is different people have perhaps identified the meanings for him or for her, and that's why the people, so many people became emotional, and this emotional reaction to Shuri Castle reminded me of let's say restoration of Kumamoto Castle Tower. It was damaged in earthquake in 2015, and this castle tower itself is a reconstruction with the reinforced concrete in 1960. From let's say from the legal point of view, I mean the legally protected cultural property point of view, this building is not protected, was not protected, but the site and Ishigaki, stone walls and foundations in Kumamoto, they have very special, let's say, importance. So the Tokubetsu Shiseki is a very, very high status as a cultural heritage. But the people's reaction, immediate reaction, was the damage of the castle tower, and millions of yens of donations were made to reconstruct the castle tower. So this emotional reaction with significance identified different people, and the values identified by the authority from cultural and historical point of view may not be all, it could be different things. So and then this said, well, the question is, whose heritage is this? But ironically speaking, in order to say this is a heritage, you need an intervention by the authority. You need a classification by authority, the applying some legal criteria. But then people realize, this is important, and then this is closer to them. So this is a little bit complicated relationship between, this is authority approach, and then people-centered approach. And then I personally am struggling to sort out clarify the relationship, but it is very complex, and then I cannot at the moment take the very clear-cut stance. Let's take a people-centered approach, period. This is not the stance that I can take at the moment. Maybe I should stop here.
Thank you. To build on it a little bit further, in the earlier discussion, the concept of colonialism also came up, and then providing space, perhaps also in school curricula, to address the complicated relationship between Japan and Okinawa, and address wider issues. Is that a role that Shuri Castle should play going forward? Should more attention be paid to that? Should the national government also acknowledge the situation more and push this in high school or junior high school curricula? Maybe again, I'll start with Professor Kono, and then maybe Professor Kainer, you can make some kind of connection to situation in the UK, because recently we've also seen images of the UK's colonial heritage and actively being destroyed on the street.
Thank you. Well, the Shurijo has very complex history, and it seems to me that some components are very much stressed by certain people, and other people stress other aspects of this history, and that they are debating each other. So this is how I see the ongoing debate on the dragon pillars and other issues, and then colonialism is on the top of that. Well, to me personally, I think in a school, I think this if you teach this aspect, then you should give all possible aspects to children. I mean, to school kids. I mean, not to emphasize one aspect or the other. So this has many layers of history, and then I mean, it might be that you should go one by one. It might be difficult for and I think an early schools and an early elementary school, but perhaps it could work in high school. But this the process. This is also a part of the process, isn't it? So I think it will be a very interesting teaching subject, I would say, but dangerous at the same time.
It's risky, and I fully agree. Maybe primary school would not be
this is not the
venue,
appropriate place for that.
But maybe already create some kind of awareness. Professor Kainer, would you like to respond?
Okay, Kono Sensei, I hope you will forgive me for what I'm about to say.
Please.
But I would say actually primary school is precisely where you do need to begin this kind of debate. And it's very much around the debate of what history is and why is it on school curricula in the first place? What are we trying to do with history? And Ellen, you're quite right. You find us here in the UK right in the middle of a storm, a political storm, which kind of is maybe the eye of the storm, if you like, is a meeting that was held just last week when our government culture secretary, Oliver Dowden, summoned the heads of 25 of our national museums and heritage organizations to a meeting to discuss the ways in which history is being presented to the public. And I've just got on my iPhone here, I've pulled up The Guardian, which is, you know, that notoriously provocative newspaper. They say, it's the Guardian view on British history we need to know. By stirring people up against an honest reckoning with our past, ministers are doing the country a huge disservice. So we're in the middle of what is being described as a culture war, if you like, between critical historians and heritage studies. Most heritage studies academics, I think, would put themselves on the critical end of academia. And a more established, perhaps a more conservative with a small c view of history, which says history is about facts and dates, and there is an authorized version of history that we ought to be learning and that we ought to be teaching. And most importantly, that there's a shared acceptance of some of that history in terms of underpinning our shared national identity. And therefore, in school curricula, that needs to be there. So that's one thing that I would say. You touched upon the other issue that happened last summer in the height of lockdown, pandemic lockdown fever, inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement, which was inspired by that terrible scenes that we saw from America last year. And it resulted in a statue in Bristol of a slaver called Edward Colston being pulled off its plinth and thrown into the river. And this caused, in many ways, this has caused this huge political upset here. Because on one side of the debate, there are people saying, yes, we must re-examine our past. We must decolonize our curricula. which means facing up to the history that underpins all of this. And on the other side of the debate, there are people saying, no, 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 we should leave all those statues there, and we should just be reinterpreting them and making sure that we add layers. Now, there are arguments on either side, good arguments on either side, and it is particularly interesting. At the moment, for example, I know in Japan there is quite the equivalent of the National Trust. There's an organization, a private membership organization, which has stewardship owns many of our most important heritage assets. And they are right in the spotlight at the moment for attempting to decolonize the stories, the narratives that they're telling. And it's one of the most, as I say, emotive, but really interesting arguments. And I think it would be really interesting to sort of take what's happening with something like Shuri and do a little bit more comparative work, in fact, around what's happening at the moment. And I did notice that because I checked out the nomination dossier last night, and the nomination, of course, went through in 1999. And there's a really interesting bit in there that just says, it's in the section which talks about the comparative analysis, which is normally done. And it says very simply, and I'm going to paraphrase, there is no effective comparator for Shuri-jo, so there's no comparative analysis. And I thought, wow, I don't believe that would get through the World Heritage Committee anymore. And it might be really interesting now to actually sort of be thinking, how can we create a framework for that more effective contextualized comparative analysis that might then further inform some of these points of view.
Professor Kono, would you like to respond to the comment of changing standards within the evaluation process? A comment such as there is no comparison. Would that still?
Well, if you compare the current nomination dossiers and those in 20 years ago, then this is totally different. I would agree. I agree with the Professor Kena that it wouldn't go through. And if you look at the nomination dossier for the Seine riverbank in Paris, it covers the vast area in Paris. It's very simple. Very simple, and so until rather recently, the nomination dossiers were pretty, let's say, lightly prepared and drafted. But currently, it's simply without a comparative analysis, then you wouldn't get it. So perhaps then, if these GUSCs were nominated now, then you would have to make a comparative analysis on a fortification in Asia Pacific, for instance. Well,
I have a very good question from the chat, from the Q&A just coming in, and it says the term Shuri Castle is being frequently and uncritically bandied about, but is this not a misnomer? The complex was never a castle any more than Buckingham Palace or Versailles. It's a literal translation of Shuri-jo, with the jo or the shiro part interpreted in the Japanese sense of a fortified castle. The complex itself was a royal palace and the seat of the Ryukyuan government. The character is, of course, read Gusku in Okinawan reading, but this term originally refers to a sacred site and bears no relation whatsoever to a castle in the conventional site. I would like to add here, my speciality is in the ancient Chinese style capitals of Japan, such as Heian-kyo, Nagaoka-kyo. And so there, the term shiro or jo, it refers to the wall. It's a walled precinct, which in effect in Japan never existed. So what with the terminology that we're using for these global heritage sites, but because in a sense, this whole recognition process also establishes the vocabulary that we use to discuss certain sites. Do you have any comments about that?
Well, this is a very good question, because I know that on the site there were I think 20 altogether, if I remember correctly, 20 or so utakis, sacred space. But the Shurijo was so heavily bombed that afterwards they could not identify where. They could not identify exactly where these utakis were. So this still it is not clearly identified, and that's why the entrance facility was not reconstructed, except the one that is a part of the components of the World Heritage Site. But this the spiritual aspect, let's say in Bhutan there are buildings originally religious, but then when the kingdom was established, then a part of the building is used for administration purpose. It is called a zone, and this has both secular and the religious functions. The Shurijo is it's a little bit I see a little bit similarity. So it's religious part and the secular parts are a sort of mixed in one side. So I mentioned the fortification, but there should be also a comparison with this religious part as well. If the nomination would be prepared now today. So it's a very good point, and so the castle is misleading in this sense. Castle focuses only one aspect of this site.
Professor Kainer, is there something you would like to add?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, Kono Sensei, and I think we mustn't forget the spiritual and the sacred nature of what we're looking at. I've got on my desk in front of me a wonderful new book by Eika Rotz, who I know is with us today, and Mark Tuan on sacred heritage in Japan. Mm-hmm. And it raises many of these issues, and indeed the work that I've been involved in around the sacred island of Okinoshima and the associated sites of the Munakata region raises exactly these questions. And one of my questions, I guess, is for our Japanese colleagues would be, my understanding is that it's quite difficult to incorporate and to designate sites on the basis of their sacredness, partly because of the clear separation between state and religion in Japan. And I've had interesting discussions with the Agency for Cultural Affairs around that, and obviously this came into focus with the inscription of the Mozu Furuichi Kofun tombs in Osaka recently. But it's a very hot area and really interesting. But my second point would be that I think language here is so important. And one of the amazing things for me that UNESCO has achieved is securing a shared language to talk about this. Heritage, that word heritage, is very difficult to translate into Japanese, for example. There isn't an obvious word for that. I never take for granted how fortunate, how lucky I am to be born a native English speaker. For one reason or another, that's the language that is now spoken and that we use for these terms. But we should never forget that there's going to be so much nuancing and variation, diversity of what these terms might mean and how they'll be taken up in other contexts. So it takes me back to my question about, I would be really interested to know what an Okinawan language perspective on this whole topic might be. And I think that's something, if you could convey that to some of those visitors who are coming off the cruise ships to visit the Shuri site, would be really, really very interesting.
Thank you. Those are excellent comments and also a very good way to kind of bring this to a close. Professor Kono, is there something, a final message that you would like to send out? Because unfortunately it seems that our 50 minutes are almost up, although I've been signaled that we can go over with a few minutes.
This is this Shurijo is a very interesting topic for me. It happened. The fire destroyed the Seiden in the same year as the Notre Dame Cathedral was damaged. 6 months after. Later. So but I got an impression that the people's reaction only on a superficial level, but the people's reactions seemed quite similar on the political side, and also the people's side are very similar from overseas, and that let's say incentivized me to organize something to compare, at least take two incidences in one place, and based on this idea, I am still on. It is still ongoing, but I started to organize a web exhibition with a focus on Shuri and Notre Dame, and I've been working with some French experts for last let's say several months, and then the work will still go on for at least another several months. And in the course of discussions with them, I learned a great deal, and I hope that this will be accessible to the public in due course, and it would give us another opportunity for further discussions. And so this is, instead of raising any questions, just I wanted to share some information with you. Thank you.
Thank you. I would certainly look forward to that. And I hope the organizers, Vicky, Ran, Ted, that you will continue this and we get more opportunities to talk about Shuri Castle, but also other heritage sites that are—
Maybe, may I add one more thing?
Yeah.
I mentioned about the similarity, at least again, between Kumamoto and then Shuri. And in the last, since I was not, it was not possible to go abroad 2020, I started to visit Kumamoto rather frequently, Kumamoto and Okinawa. And then I discovered that some old vernacular houses were simply demolished since they were not designated as cultural properties legally, although they had some values, and but simply it was not in these values were not sort of institutionalized in a sense, and so it was just a property. So everything was left in the owner's hand, and I thought that okay, so this needs to be further investigated. Why we couldn't save these buildings? These buildings could be cultural assets for the recovery of the area or the community, but the law didn't respond properly. So this is another theme that I've been working on. So it is still ongoing, but thank you.
Yes, it was a theme that was on my list, the revitalization and decentralization efforts, and but we don't have time to go into that. Let me start with thanking you both for offering your opinions and participating here, thanking the audience and thanking the organizers.